Hello, I'm Sean Wilson, and I'm going to provide a little bit of a presentation on the demographics of junior and collegiate cycling, examining 2018 relative to some of the previous years, and we'll also be looking at some comparative analysis to the data from the National Interscholastic Cycling Association. I want to have say a special thanks to the collaborators on this project, including Drew Coggin, who's a graduate student at the University of Southern California, who's doing some additional work on sport identity, and we'll be seeing that data coming soon. I want to say a thanks to Jacob Razuk, who was a high school student in my laboratory this past summer at Loma Linda University. Hunter Wilson, who's worked with us the last couple of years on portions of the data from Redlands High School, and then Bill Ludecki from Mabra, who provided a lot of the WP Universal downloads from the early 2000s out to about 2016. And this provides a lot of the basis data for what we were able to analyze. So the first thing we want to look at here is the number of licenses versus the athlete age, looking at both males and females in this current year, 2018. And what we find is that there is a large number of juniors within the racing population, and then there's a fall off when they go to college. We see then another increase in ridership up to the mid-30s. And then a secondary peak here for riders in their late 40s, early 50s. What we're going to see when we look at the older data sets is that there is a procession marching out of the ages in these older age groups, such that these are well-retained athletes for the most part, and then we see this last trailing off as the athletes become older. So here we look at the 2007 age data, and we see that there's a marked difference in terms of the ridership across those age groups. When we look at males versus females, we see that we actually have more females involved now than we did in the past, and especially when we look in the junior age groups, there's a much larger percentage of female athletes involved. When we look at those junior athletes in more depth, what we find is that they are having an increased involvement in the sport and an increased percentage of the total number of riders. When we look at this secondary peak here, what you find is that this is 2007 versus 2018. So this large peak here at 38 to 40 has now moved forward in time, so that it's this same general ridership, and there's not been a backfill of those athletes in those age groups. So there's not as good of retention of athletes as they move from the younger age groups out to the older ones. And we'll look at that in a little bit more depth. So now when we look at the new riders that are coming into the sport, so this is just looking at the 2008 ridership for males and females, is that there was a general rise from the junior athlete ages up to a peak of about 40 years old, and then it trailed off as the athletes were older. And when we look at males versus females, is that it's a fairly reasonable percentage of athletes coming in as females, but not as much in the older junior age groups and not as much in the collegiate age groups as we would like. Flash forward to 2018, and we find that the demographic profiles of these new licenses is completely different. In particular, what we find is that we're getting a large percentage of new junior riders relative to the other age groups, and especially when you look here at the number of licenses in the masters age groups has actually started trailing off, and we're seeing the biggest growth in the junior athlete pools. Worrisome is this dip in the collegiate years, where we're not seeing as many collegiate age riders coming in, even relative to the mid 2000s. So that's something that needs to be addressed. When we look at the junior ridership in more detail from 2007 to 2018, and we look at the males versus females, what we find is that we are seeing large growth in the junior ridership, even though the total ridership for USA Cycling has been falling off, which is data that we're not showing here today. And then when we look at the females, the growth rates aren't quite as high as for the males, but they are growing in a year-over-year manner, which is good. Here we've overlaid the male and female ridership from 2007, which is shown in red, versus the 2017 numbers in green. And you can see that there's a large increase in the ridership across all junior age groups, both for males and for females in recent years, but the numbers for the collegiate athletes has not really changed. So we'll take a little bit more look at this to see what's happening between junior and collegiate athletics in the next couple of slides. So the first thing that we looked at was the category of riders in the junior athlete pools, and what we find is that there's a large number of novice athletes in the junior athlete pools and not so much in the more advanced category groups. So this is illustrating that there may be a trapping of those athletes in those novice athlete pools and not good pathway progression for them to get up into become more advanced riders. When we look at the collegiate cycling growth versus junior growth, what we find is that we have this nice growth in the juniors, but the collegiate athletics has been fairly stable over time and not really growing, and there may even be a decrease in the ridership. The way that we derive these numbers for the collegiate groups was based on self-identification within the WP Universal with a collegiate club, which poses some error because we have already noted that some athletes have moved forward and are no longer actually collegiate athletes, but they are still reporting within the system as being involved with a collegiate club. So these numbers may not be 100% correct, but they are, I think, generally reflective of the athlete pool, which is not really growing substantially over time. I'm not sure why we have this 50% drop off in the last 2 years, and if it may be a reporting issue within the WP Universal database. When we look at the category of the riders within the collegiate system, what we find is that there's much more balance within those riders. Whereas in the junior athlete pools, we see this trapping of riders in the predominantly in the category 5 ranks. We see that there's much greater balance across all the category groups for both men and women athletes, where there's a high percentage of upper category riders and even professional athletes that identify as collegiate, which provides, in some ways, my bias is that this is increasing the health of that system because it allows for greater interaction of good role models with more novice athletes, whereas in the junior ranks we don't have as much interaction in that same way. Is that these category 5 athletes don't necessarily have a peer group that's more advanced than them to help them stay in the sport for long periods of time and to learn about the sport in a very robust way. When we look at the collegiate system in more depth, what we find is that it's actually based on a mix of new riders as well as retained juniors. So when we look at the total ridership here, number of licenses based on athlete age, we can see that there's very few athletes that are age 19 or so. This was from 2017 data, whereas a lot of the athletes were a bit older than that, 20 through 23 or so. So these 19-year-olds, for the most part, reflect a mix of junior athletes who are aging out, and then these are the newly licensed collegiate athletes for males and females. And what we find is that a portion of that pool, about 25%, is coming in from new ridership. So these are freshmen who are taking out licenses and being recruited into the collegiate pools, and then about 2/3 to 3/4 of those athletes are actually juniors who are continuing on in the sport. But most of your ridership within the collegiate system, the new riders are being recruited at ages 20 through 23. So these are upperclassmen or even graduate students that are coming into the sport later on, possibly from other sports or through other means. And those are coming in and provide a new pool of ridership. There does seem to be reasonable retention over time. In this case, when you look at the number of athletes versus the number of athletes, new athletes versus the total number of athletes. So we took a much closer look at that as well. So when we look at the percentage of U25 riders that are racing for their college, what we find that it's very, very high. So if we look at the total ridership here, and this is for 2017, the number of licenses, is that the total ridership, as we talked about, it falls when they go into college. But when we look at the collegiate athletes, what we find is that by the time they're age 20, a very high percentage, roughly 2/3, are racing for their colleges, and then it seems like they're continuing on after college possibly. When we've looked at retention of ridership across all ages, and these were numbers from Southern California, but they're reflected in the national databases too. Independent of the year that you take out your license, so this would be taking out a license here in 2001, 2002, out through 2016 in this case. What you find is that on a year-over-year basis is that we have a large loss of ridership. And there are multiple reasons for this, but in some ways we can just say that there is a misidentification of the athlete or a failure to provide them appropriate pathways that allow them to or help them continue in the sport for long periods of time. So our retention rates are about 10% over a 3-year time frame, so very, very low retention of athletes. We wanted to know if the retention rates were better amongst junior riders, which may have better access to pathways, or the collegiate athlete experiences. So when we took a look at this in more detail for athletes retained from the 2007 athlete pool, and we looked at 15 to 18-year-olds shown in blue, and the 19 to 24-year-olds shown in red, is that we see that there is a drop-off in the ridership on a year-over-year basis when we track those athletes across time. And this shows the total athlete pool here just within Southern California. And this was actually the national database here from 2007. Overall, there is a failure to retain those athletes better than the total athlete pool. So we then took another vignette looking at Team Velosport, which is a large center of excellence for junior cycling in Southern California, and it has a robust system for engaging with the athletes. And the idea was that possibly by having this increased engagement, that would increase retention of those athletes within the racing pool. And what we found is that when we looked at a subsample of athletes between 2007 and 2010 who started during those years, and that was 17 riders, there was only a 4.1 year mean lifetime for those athletes when we looked at them across a number of years, and only a number of those became collegiate athletes. So really, even though there was better engagement with the athletes, within this singular team is that it did not seem to improve the retention rates of those athletes. We also took a look at the age of start for individual athletes to determine whether or not if you started an athlete early and provide them pathways, will that modify how they're retained within the sport? And in fact, we find that it does. If you take a look at the athletes who start in 2008 and you look at their ages that they start, and then we look at them when they become U23 riders, if you start them very, very early, ages 10 and 11, is that you end up with fairly low retention rates. So if you start them very early, you can end up with low retention as they move into college, whereas if you start them in middle school, you can have better retention, and then as high school age athletes going in, is that you have even higher retention of those athletes as they move through becoming older aged riders. So that's something to keep in mind, that starting them in middle school or later is probably a good thing, and starting them out too early may be a detriment to their long-term development and retention in sport. We then took a look at the National Interscholastic Cycling Association, which began in Northern California in the late 1990s. And it grew out of Berkeley High School, and it had very humble beginnings with less than 100 athletes in its initial years. And then as it grew throughout Northern California, you can see that it underwent linear growth up to 2009 when they became a nationally oriented program. And when we look at this in 2009, they had a 5-year growth projection that they were going to have about 14,000 people involved by 2015. And they broke this out into different phases for a 5-year development plan, where they were going to expand through different states on a year-over-year basis. And when we flash forward to 2017, what we find is that their growth rates were either on target or exceeded expectations. So they have, as of 2017, they had about 14,000 athletes, 5,000 of which were middle schoolers, and they had over 10,000 volunteers and 6,000 coaches. So they've built themselves a very nice ecosystem that's very robust and has a lot of depth to it. When we look at the growth rate for when they became a national organization, what we find is that they are either in a linear growth phase or even maybe an exponential growth phase still, where they're growing in a very large way on a year-over-year basis. 2017, they had over 20,000 students and coaches involved, and that has grown even into 2018. And you can see that this is translating into many hours on the bike, and it's translating into dollars for the industry. When we looked at the crossover rates between the riders within the NICA ecosystem versus with USA Cycling, what we find is there's very little interaction there. There's only about 13% of the athletes who transferred across, and we were looking at riders at the state championships in California, and we just looked at the 15 to 18-year-old athlete pools and looked for athletes that were in both groups. And this was done just this last July in 2018, so the data is very current. So overall, what we find is that when we look at junior athletes, the athlete numbers are increasing for USA Cycling. This is a good thing. The recruitment is increased dramatically relative to 2007, 2008. The recruitment is still well below its potential, however, especially when we look at how NICA has grown over the last number of years. The interaction with NICA is well below its potential, and it's something that can be improved on. The retention within USA Cycling is very low. The transition to college is much lower than it could be, and many athletes are becoming trapped in the novice categories. When we look at collegiate athletes, the athlete numbers are flat or falling, so this is not a good thing. It's something that can be worked on. Recruitment seems to be mostly amongst the upperclassmen, and they're not freshmen so much that are coming in. We find, based on other ancillary data, that the NICA athletes are not continuing when they go to college. They're remaining within that kind of NICA framework, but they're continuing to ride bikes based on other anecdotal information that we've had from the industry. Many U25 riders actually do race in college, which is a good thing. So our U23, U25 athlete pool is predominantly collegiate. The athletes amongst the collegiate athletics are spread across multiple categories. So that's a real asset, and it provides a good mentorship opportunities for your novice athletes, and it allows them to develop. The recommendations based on these data sets are to take a much further evaluation of the athletes in existing USA Cycling clubs and examine the retention rates amongst those clubs. In particular, we should be looking at the National Centers of Excellence to see if they're doing anything that can help us recruit and retain the riders and get them through the pathways in a much more rapid fashion than the overall athlete pool that we have. We need to track the individual ridership across multiple years to see how they're progressing. We need to evaluate other novel models for junior athletics. We need to look at scholastic programs such as the Youth Educational Sports Program run by Tana Ball in Southern California, which is using cycling as a PE class. We need to look at other national governing bodies such as USA Swimming, USA Triathlon to see what they're doing and how they're able to recruit large numbers of athletes. And we need to look at other youth sports such as the American Youth Soccer Organization. We need to be looking at football and baseball to see what types of things they're doing to recruit and retain and provide pathways for those youth. We need to come up with some long-term goals such as enhancing recruitment, enhancing pathway development. Especially we need to focus on helping riders move through novice categories, and we need to support ridership in competitive and non-competitive environments, and we need to improve the transition to the collegiate environment and provide long-term retention of those athletes within the USA Cycling environment. I want to thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to moving forward with this project into the future.